In the Declaration of Independence, Thomas Jefferson wrote that all people are endowed with certain inalienable rights, and that among them are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. But what is happiness, and how do you pursue it? And what has happiness got to do with American freedom?
It's interesting, those three terms used to be life, liberty, and property. But by changing property to the pursuit of happiness, Jefferson made American freedom a much more open-ended quest for individual fulfillment, not just owning property, but somehow finding the best in yourself, developing as an individual. So at its best, I think American freedom represents this notion of opportunity for people to define their own lives, to exercise self-determination, regardless of all the different barriers, whether it's race or gender, region, origin, that in so many places in the world restrict people's freedom.
In the early years of the nation, there were lots of answers to the question of how to pursue happiness. Some said happiness was being rich. Some said it was going to school or having a healthy family. Daniel Boone said happiness could be found by going west and seeking a new life across the Appalachians.
Curiosity is natural to the soul of man. I left my family and domestic happiness for a time to wander through the wilderness of America.
Daniel Boone was an adventurer who went searching for a land across the mountains that the Indians called Kentucky, which meant meadowland. It was said to be beautiful country, filled with high grasses, birds, buffalo, deer, and beaver. But the search for Kentucky was anything but easy.
My footsteps have been marked with blood. 2 darling sons and a brother have I lost to savage hands. Many dark and sleepless nights have I been separated from the cheerful society of men. But after a long and fatiguing journey through the mountainous wilderness, we saw with pleasure the beautiful level of Kentucky.
The Indian Trail that Boone had discovered winding through the mountains stretched for 300 miles. Boone blazed it and widened it, and within the next 2 decades, 200,000 people went west in search of happiness along what would become known as the Wilderness Road.
Thus we behold Kentucky, lately a howling wilderness, now become the habitation of civilization.
In the decades following Daniel Boone's trailblazing, the movement westward continued. The goal now became to cross the Missouri River and settle lands in the great open prairies beyond. After Mexico became independent of Spain in 1821, wagon loads of traders began pushing southwest, cutting deep ruts in a path that was called the Santa Fe Trail.
Bound away across the wide Missouri.
Only a few American women had ever attempted to make the grueling trip when 18-year-old Susan McGoffin headed west from Missouri. Newly married and pregnant, she was excited by the adventure.
Oh, this is a life I would not exchange for a good deal. There is such independence, so much free, uncontaminated air, which impregnates the mind, the feelings, nay, every thought, with purity. I breathe free without that oppression and uneasiness felt in the gossiping circles of a settled home.
Soon, hundreds of thousands of Americans were discovering the freedom and opportunity of the Great West, including a Missouri farmer who wrote home to his mother, trying to convince her to join him.
Out in Oregon, I can get me a square mile of land and a quarter section for each of y'all. Dad burden me, I'm done with the country. Winters, it's frost and snow to freeze a body. Summers, the overflow from the old muddy drowns half my acres. Taxes take the yield of them that's left. What say, Ma? It's God's country.
It is possible that friends are overawed by power. It cannot overawe me. The people are the sovereign power. The officers are their agents.
Andrew Jackson was nicknamed Old Hickory because this man from the West was as tough as hickory wood. He had started out life as a poor man in Tennessee and had risen to become a general in the War of 1812. That war against England was called the Second War for Independence, and in it, Andrew Jackson became a national hero. When he was elected the 7th President of the United States in 1828, he was the first chief executive not from Virginia or Massachusetts. And the people, ordinary people, knew they had finally elected one of their own. On Inauguration Day, it seemed as if they all came out to celebrate.
The rich and powerful too often bend the acts of government to their selfish purposes. The humble members of society, the farmers, mechanics, and laborers have a right to complain.
But the first People's President didn't care about the rights of some of the people, the Native Americans. Like most white Americans, Jackson wanted Indian land, but didn't know a fair way to get it. The problem with the Indians, he said, was that they were savages and uncivilized, and that meant he could simply take their land.
Those tribes cannot exist surrounded by our settlements. They have neither the intelligence nor the moral habits. Established in the midst of a superior race, they must disappear.
But the Cherokees, whose land stretched across the southern Appalachian Mountains in a semicircle that reached from Kentucky to Alabama, confounded the whites. They farmed, built schools, formed a government, and built a capital city. They became prosperous and didn't fit the Indian stereotype. But the wealthier the Cherokees became, the more anxious other people were to have their land. A Cherokee spokesman gave voice to his people's worries.
We are aware that some persons suppose it will be for our advantage to remove beyond the Mississippi. We think otherwise. We wish to remain on the land of our fathers. We have a perfect and original right to remain. The treaties with us guarantee our residence and our privileges and secure us against intruders. Our only request is that these treaties be fulfilled.
But in 1830, following intense debate, Congress passed the Indian Removal Act. That made it legal to throw the natives off their land and move them west. In Georgia, the government held a lottery and gave away Cherokee land to white settlers.
The Cherokee happened to sit on very valuable land which cotton plantation owners wanted for the expansion of slavery. And so under the presidency of Andrew Jackson and then Van Buren, you had the Cherokee removal, the forced removal of many thousands of men, women, and children out to new lands in Oklahoma. Of course, they didn't want to go, but they had no choice. The Army moved them out, and on that long so-called Trail of Tears, maybe a quarter of them died along the way. This was certainly one of the most shameful moments in American history. If you want to use a modern term, you'd have to call it the ethnic cleansing of the United States, the removal of a people purely because of their racial and ethnic status to make way for white settlers taking over their land.
Many Indians in the East had long seen what was coming. The great orator, Chief Red Jacket of the Iroquois, once spoke to a delegation of white clergymen.
Brothers, our seats were once large, and yours were small. You have now become a great people, and we have scarcely a place left to spread our blankets. You have got our country, but are not satisfied. You want to force your religion upon us. Brothers, we only want to enjoy our own.
Tecumseh, the great Shawnee warrior leader, summed up the plight of Native Americans.
We gave them forest-clad mountains, valleys full of game. In return, they gave us rum and trinkets and a grave.
In 1844, James K. Polk of Tennessee was elected President of the United States. Like his hero, Andrew Jackson, he believed in his country's right to lands in the West. Polk wanted Oregon and also California, which was owned by Mexico. Many white Americans believed they had a natural right to the land. They called this privilege manifest destiny. Those words, written by a reporter named Jane Casno, were first published in 1845 by newspaper owner John O'Sullivan.
It is our manifest destiny to overspread the continent allotted by Providence for the free development of our yearly multiplying millions.
Manifest means obvious or not open to dispute or debate. What he meant was that the destiny of the United States to take over the whole continent of North America, to spread to the Pacific, to spread to Canada, Mexico, to occupy this entire great land mass, was obvious. You couldn't even dispute it. It had been given by God to the United States, and it was part of this expansion of liberty. Once you say that your destiny, your future is ordained by God, that it represents the future of freedom, once you say it's obvious and not open to dispute, then anything you do is justifiable.
In 1846, the second year of his presidency, Polk signed a treaty with Great Britain giving England the territory which today is Western Canada. In return, the U.S. took what is now Oregon, Washington, Idaho, and parts of Montana. Then President Polk went to war against Mexico.
The war with Mexico was forced upon us. Yet it was clear that we would, if practicable, obtain California and such other portions of the Mexican territory as would be sufficient to defray the expenses of the war.
The war lasted for 2 years. When it ended in 1848, the border between Texas and Mexico was set at the Rio Grande River, and the United States also got California, which at that time meant land that stretched from Texas to the Pacific Ocean and as far north as Wyoming. When gold was discovered that same year in California, it lured people westward in ever greater numbers. Gold fever became a national epidemic. Louise Clapp was an Eastern journalist who traveled to California to report on the gold camps.
Gold mining is nature's great lottery scheme. A man may work a claim for many months and be poorer at the end of the time than when he commenced, or he may take out thousands in a few hours. It is a mere matter of chance.
Gold was also found in Oregon, Nevada, Wyoming, Montana, Idaho, Colorado, and Alaska. Stories of lucky miners filled the newspapers, and that kept people coming. They came from almost every country you could imagine, in search of economic opportunity, for happiness, and for personal freedom. America was becoming a country of immigrants.